Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. What a great crowd. A sea of red out there. You ought to come up and look at it from this perspective. It looks terrific. You all look beautiful this morning. It's really, really great to be with you and have this opportunity to talk about so many issues that are important to our country. So when I grew up in North Jersey, in a little town called Woodridge, New Jersey. Anyone from Jersey here? Yeah. So Woodridge is right next to Giant Stadium. And that stadium was important to me, not just because I was a big Giants fan growing up. I know. But because my dad was an electrician. He was in a union called the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Anyone heard of that? There you go. And he was out of work in the early 70s, and then they did a major public works projects in North Jersey. And they built Giant Stadium, they built the Meadowlands Racetrack, and then they built a basketball arena that was then called the Brendan Byrne Arena. And he worked there the whole time. It got him back to work and got a lot of people back to work. And when I was a kid, my dad used to say around the kitchen table, when we first started talking about politics, and we didn't talk about politics all that much. Neither of my parents went to college, so they weren't particularly sophisticated people, but they had really good judgment, common sense. And what my dad used to tell me about politics is he said, listen, it's really simple. If you care about workers, you vote for the Democrats. That's what he would tell me. And those lessons stuck with me to this day. That union took really good care of us when I was young. We always had health care, even when my dad wasn't working. When he worked, he had good wages. When I went off to college at Columbia University in New York City, which is a great school, little Columbia there, that union actually paid for half of my tuition through a scholarship that they had created for the child of a member. What they really did is they actually created an opportunity for someone to have an opportunity that none of them have had. When I went to Columbia University, it's something that absolutely changed my life. I got a great education there. It allowed me to go to law school right up the street from here at Georgetown, where the best thing that could have ever happened to me happened. I met my wife, and we've been happily married, and we have 4 amazing daughters. I became an entrepreneur, and I started 2 businesses, took them public, created thousands of jobs. My companies were always voted the best places to work in their communities, something I was really proud of. But I remember when I was taking my first company public on the New York Stock Exchange in 1996. And at the time, I was 33. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. And when you take a company public on the New York Stock Exchange, you go into that building and you ring a bell. And I did that. But you could also look out the window, and I would actually be able to, from that New York Stock Exchange, I saw across the Hudson River, and I saw Jersey City, which is where my dad's union was based. And I remember thinking, hand to God, when I was 33 years old, that about 10 or 12 years ago, I was going to some union hall in Jersey City to thank a bunch of electricians during the summer for giving me a scholarship, which is a great reminder that no one does it alone in this world. You hear these people say this all the time. You know, they're successful, they make a lot of money, and they say, I did it on my own. We all know that's not true. You drive across the Memorial Bridge at night, and you look at Arlington Cemetery, and you realize none of us would have the opportunities we have but for those people sacrificing everything for us. And so we're all in this together. And this notion of common purpose, which I think is the beating heart of this nation, which we've lost a little bit of. We got to get back. We got to get back. And the Democratic Party in particular has to get back to this notion that a worker and the working family has to be at the center of all our policies. The center of the center of all of our policies are doing things to help workers and help their families so that when they do what they're supposed to do, which is to work hard and play by the rules and be responsible in their lives, which we all have to do that they have the kind of opportunities that I've had and that so many of you have had, which we know are fleeting in this country. You know, the generation of young Americans today is going to be the first generation ever in this country's history that does not do better than their parents. Think about that. The first time ever. If you were born in 1950 in the United States of America, the chances of you having a higher standard of living than your parents was 90%. 1980 it was down to 50%. 2010 they expect it to be 20%. Think about that. The American dream is evaporated in one generation. Now, part of that is due to the decline in what you all do, or what you're doing here, which is fighting for workers and fighting for unions. The decline in union membership in the United States of America is directly correlated to the decline in living standards for so many Americans. Because what I think people never understand about people in the labor movement, you all just don't fight for your own contracts, you fight for workers everywhere. And when unions have a smaller footprint, then workers everywhere, whether they're in a union or not, are not as well represented. That's how I think about it. And so when we think about our policies as Democrats, and I can tell you, as someone who's running for president, I can tell you where my policies line up. They line up with the worker. First of all, we have to make sure we're fighting so that you have the rights to organize and bargain. And that includes pushing back on something that's happening now at the federal level. We've seen this spread of these right-to-work laws all over this country. Terrible. They were good at marketing. It's a clever name, but it's bad policy. And you know, now they're trying to get it done at the federal level. We got to fight that. When we think tax policy, and there's a lot of talk about tax policy, we have to make sure we're doing things that focus on the worker, which is why I'm such a huge supporter of something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I think should be the centerpiece of our tax policy. And I've called for it to be doubled. And I want to rename it, because I think the Earned Income Tax Credit is a terrible name. No one knows what it means. It should be called the Workers' Tax Credit, because it puts money in the pocket of hard-working Americans. And that's what we need. Right? One of the problems in this country right now is not necessarily jobs, but it's pay. As we see, unemployment's going down. But so many of these jobs don't pay enough. But if we actually orient our tax policy around things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or like I said, the Workers' Tax Credit, and we double that, which we can pay for completely by raising the capital gains rate, so that people who invest for a living pay the same rate as people who work for a living, that seems pretty fair to me. Right? That's a simple thing to do. That's a simple thing to do. Make investors pay the same rate as workers, take that money and invest it in the Workers' Tax Credit. Very simple, very straightforward. You don't need to do anything different. You just need to move some numbers around. And that will really help workers in this country. That's what we should stand for as Democrats. When we talk about health care, right, I believe, like so many Democrats running for president, that every American should have health care as a right. It's a human right. It's smart economic policy. But I don't think we should be advocating for plans that take away your health care. Right? This notion of a single-payer health care system, while it sounds good and it's a good soundbite, what that means is that what you work so hard for, and what these gentlemen on these stages for work so hard to negotiate, you're not going to be able to have anymore. And that's just not smart policy. You know, last year, Medicaid, which is the biggest health care program in this country, only paid 80% of health care costs. So if we were all running a hospital and we just took Medicaid, we'd lose 20%, and our hospital would close. Medicare only paid 95% of health care costs. So if we were all running a hospital and we just took Medicare, our hospital would ultimately close. And your insurance right? Private insurance, so many of you have, which your union negotiates for you. They pay about 115% of health care. So we shouldn't be advocating for the government to be the only payer of health care. That doesn't make sense. But we should advocate for there to be a basic government plan that everyone has a right, that everyone gets health care as a basic right, but you should be allowed to negotiate and improve that policy for your workers. That's the kind of universal health care plan that the Democratic Party should be calling for, because that allows workers who work hard and are represented to continue to have good health care. When we talk about climate change, which is a huge priority for our party, as it should be, it's an existential threat to the next generation of Americans, we have to be focusing on a strategy that's actually good for workers as well, which is one of the reasons I've called for, among many things in my climate strategy, I've called for the United States of America to be the leader in what I'm referring to as negative emissions technologies. These are machines that actually exist. The National Academy of Sciences just did a huge report on them. They work. They actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. The problem is they're really expensive. But we can solve that problem because we solved it with wind and we solved it with solar. If I were speaking to you 30 years ago, I would say wind and solar are great, but they're too expensive. But we created a market for them through tax credits. And they've been building them everywhere, and the prices come down. So I'm calling for the United States to do the same thing for these negative emissions technologies, which capture carbon out of the atmosphere. People estimate 30% of the carbon between now and 2050 can be captured. And by the way, it'll be a huge industry building the machines that'll do this. I want to locate them in the heartland of the United States of America, and I'm calling for us building a CO2 pipeline. Yes, a pipeline to take carbon that's captured and transfer it to where it can be used for good purposes. That's a climate strategy that not only addresses the real problem with climate change, but puts the United States of America to be the country that leads this next wave of innovation and creates enormous jobs in the process. When we talk about domestic economic policy, we should have infrastructure as the centerpiece of that policy. It creates jobs, good middle-skilled, middle-class jobs. It improves the life of our citizens, and it makes our businesses more competitive. And we can do it. It's the one last bipartisan issue. So the things I'm running on, whether it be health care, whether it be climate, whether it be tax policy, whether it be things to improve our economy, they're all focused on this notion that the worker has to be at the center of those strategies. Because if we do things to improve the lives of working Americans, if we just do that and rebuild the middle class in the process, in a funny way, all of our other problems take care of themselves. The political dysfunction in this country starts taking care of themselves because there's less anger. We actually start doing things that matter, and people see that their government can work again. And again, we remind the American people that we're all in this together. At our core, we're an optimistic bunch. We want to leave the world better than we found it. We want to do real things that matter so that my kids and your grandkids maybe, and hopefully one day my grandkids, actually inherit a world where the jobs are better, living standards are higher, the environment is sustainable, and we have debts, or they inherit debts they can repay. We can do it, but we have to do it all together. And we have to recommit ourselves to the values that have made this country what it is. And a key tenet of those values is putting the worker first. And so I'm so grateful to be with you here today. I'm so thankful for what you do. You're part of a big family. You know, I remember when my dad passed away 2 years ago. He was in that union for 60 years. And we were at this little funeral home in northern New Jersey. It was kind of a one-room funeral home, so until the wake started, the doors didn't really open. And the wake was supposed to start at 3 o'clock. And I was there with the guy who ran the funeral home, who I'd known my whole life. And at 2:45, we looked out at the parking lot. And there was a line of about 50, 80-year-old guys waiting to come in to see my dad at his wake. And they were all the electricians he worked with. One guy made a joke. He said there's a lot of empty bar stools this afternoon in North Jersey. And those guys have their names on those stools. But it reminded me that a union is more than a contract. It's a family. And you take care of each other. And that's terrific. But we also have to have a country that takes care of all workers and really puts the workers first. Because if we do that as a party, guess what? We're going to win every election. That's right. Every election. We talk about workers, we're going to win every election. We talk about jobs and pay and health care and stuff that matter to people at their kitchen table, we're going to win every election. And then we'll get some real things done. And then we'll leave the world better than we found it. Because that's our job. The people who have the privilege of serving, that's our job. So again, I want to thank you for having me. It's great to be here with everyone, and God bless you all. Thank you.